Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on the topic of designing for the unknown, writing extensible code. Before we really dive deep in, first a thank you to the sponsors. Without the sponsors, nothing of this would have been possible. So thank you. All right, I'm Fred, working at Microsoft as a cloud solution architect, and I've got a few hobbies, most notably gaming, reading, bartending, and bragging about my toys. Some of in this room probably have already fell victim of that during this conference. Thank you for the patience. On the topic of those toys, there are a few notable projects where you can find more of that. Most notably, you will find a very large filled GitHub with lots of PowerShell nerdiness. Some of that useful, some of that is going to play the Imperial March using beep tones. So your mileage might vary. So, what are we going to do? We are going to look at my approach to writing extensible code and how to make it flexible in environments that I didn't even foresee, or in customer projects where the requirements were like 2 months late, as might happen. From a technical implementation perspective, it's not all that much, but from the concepts perspective, like what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Or what are the problems, plural, I'm trying to solve with this? When is it the right tool? That's a bit more. So I'm going to be starting with that. So when the demo comes in, you can have kind of some mental box to put things in. We are most notably going to look into when two organizations kind of are supposed to work together without actually working together. How I can make my module extensible so that they can use it for their purposes without me having to make target-specific adjustments. We are also going to look how I can segment out a large project into one simple extensibility, while the large of this colossus of a complex project doesn't need to be touched for that. Again, we'll have examples for that. And how to tie into flow control before we're doing the whole thing in demo part. So, what the hell is one of the key problems I'm trying to solve? And that is when multiple organizations get involved. I've got Contoso Limited going on here, and they have one nifty admin who's writing Contoso logging. And he's doing a real good job with that. He's solving lots of internal problems with that, and he's got an even greater boss who allows him to open source it on GitHub. So everybody on the world is now free to use this superior logging option. Now, there's this Fabricam in corporate who had another engineer who attended the same conference as this admin from Contoso. And he thought, hey, this project is great. I'm going to use this for all of my tools. So he's got this identity tools module for all of the identity management. He's got a huge requirement to log things. And, well, there it goes. They use it in scripts. They use it in other tools inside the company. So 1 year goes in, everything is fine. Problem is now they get a new SIEM solution in Fabricam. They're building their own SIEM solution with their own specific required calls to call to that. And the Contoso logging no longer does the job because the admin that wrote Contoso logging had absolutely no idea what Fabricam is going to do there on the other side of the continent. I mean, why the hell would he have any Fabricam-specific implementations? I mean, seriously, if I was an admin at Fabricam, I would be extremely worried if he had Fabricam-specific implementations. So, as the Fabricam admin, now I can say, okay, I'm going to make a permanent fork of Contoso logging and just make a permanent copy that has my modifications in there. So I've got my own little island version of that. That makes it, of course, a lot harder to get any more updates if the admin on the Contoso side decides to add new features, better reliability, fix some bugs. So at that point, I basically own all the further maintenance on that thing. I can contribute to Contoso logging, but my boss is going to be angry with me if I provide Fabricam-specific implementation, and the owner of Contoso logging is not going to be happy with having to maintain extra code that is specific to a single organization. So at that point, we need something that allows us to work together, which is where plugins come in. So this Contoso logging actually has a plugin system and comes out of the box with a few logging plugins already provided, and a clear documentation how to write your own plugin. And in that case, the only thing identity tools would be required on Fabricam side, it's provide its own plugin for their own Fabricam logging solution. And then provide some config, some way to enable that it's using that. Yeah. Scenario number one. With that kind of cooperation, the developer of Contoso doesn't have to really know who else is going to use it how, as long as it provides a tool to extend that. Some standard plugin interface for that. The second thing, next part that we need to kind of think about is like, how do we provide these kinds of plugins? There is a very common one I applied straight to memory. The most common plugin-based system in PowerShell everybody in this room uses every single time they open a PowerShell console and has been using it for, well, since it released, is the PowerShell provider system. Get item, get child item. Hey, yes, that works with the file system. It also works with your certificate store, with your VS-Man drive, with your registry. And if you're importing the Active Directory module, yes, you can remove item in an Active Directory user. It might not be the best idea or the best tool for the job, but it can do the job. So a module is imported, and as part of its import sequence, it registers the new plugin straight into the memory of the module or into the system that's providing the plugin system. In case of PowerShell provider, that's the engine itself. In case of Contoso logging, that would be the module scope of Contoso logging. This has several strengths. Most notably, there's exactly zero dependency outside of I need to get the modules loaded. I can have my identity tools take a dependency on Contoso logging, and it's always going to be there, no matter exactly in what context I load that. So, useful for that. We also have another option, and that is we provide a config file on disk. Because when we have this loading to memory thing, we have one problem. There's absolutely no auto-discovery for the plugin until the other module is loaded. I can try to CD into an Active Directory path, but if I don't have the Active Directory module loaded, that's not going to be very successful. There's not going to be an autoload or anything like that. And if I want to avoid this problem, I could provide a central location, file system, registry, whatever, where I once register, like, this is my plugin, this is where you find me. The most commonly known module that uses this approach is secret management from the PowerShell team. We do once the register call, and I can then start a new console, run get secret, and since the store is already registered, it is going to load the necessary module. So this has the advantage that I don't need to have the extra plugin already loaded before I'm trying to use it. So there's some usability experience here. From a development perspective, finding the correct path where to store this configuration can be interesting once you go into cross-platform. There's also situations where you might not have a fully loaded user profile with all environment variables available and other fun edge cases. So that's a bit more technically challenging. It's doable, but it's a bit more annoying. There's one more. We can try an auto-discover. We have this seen in exactly one location so far. And I have switched away from that the moment that was technically feasible. We are talking about role capabilities for just enough administration. By default, you have the ability to specify the name, and it's automatically going to search all of your modules under program files for that role capability by name, and the first hit wins. That is, well, please don't. Just please don't. There's going to be discovery performance cost, and you are definitely going to risk having somebody else inject something earlier in the search sequence. We already have that with with command discovery. Try running get VM on a machine that has both Hyper-V and VMware modules installed. So there is a headache with that involved. Please try and avoid option 3 when you can. But if you have some special edge cases, I'm not going to judge too badly. Okay, plugin system for extensibility covered. The second part, a complicated project. This is what I'm going to show right now in a flowchart diagram is a project I implemented for a customer. The purpose was to have a secure virtual machine deployment with shielding and SCVVM and object level delegation and lots of complex features. It all starts in Azure DevOps. We have an admin who is going to provide both modules and configuration settings that are available to the Azure DevOps and connecting to a just enough administration endpoint that we had to implement, of course, and provisions all of that to this endpoint. At that point, we need some modules on this GR endpoint to manage all of that so everything is covered properly. Then there's the user who's going to use the virtual machine deployment client module to connect to this GR endpoint, implement some roles implementation that is going to be applied on the object level. So I can delegate individual domains to deploy virtual machines into and similar delegation scenarios. We are going to get some information from Active Directory, have some PKA flows to get some live virtual machine PKA certificate deployed so network already works. And then we are going to SCVMM, update the library, and do a lot more technical and annoying steps until finally we have this virtual machine going out there. And this virtual machine now needs to configure itself, which again needs more modules. Now, this is the kind of solution where I kind of kindly ask the customer if they want me to extend this even further, please book a full week so I can find my way into it again. My memory is lousy. This is a complex nightmare. And if anybody wants to change this, they'll have to have some significant time investment to figure out all of the pieces. And by the way, this is a simplification, a significant simplification. So yeah, they don't really need to change this all that much. They have a very limited scope of things that they frequently need to change. Specifically, they might need to change what happens inside of the virtual machine and how that is selected and delegated. So basically, they need some config changes at the top. And this little thing this guest config is doing. So these things is all what they really need. So if I extend the guest config module to be plugin based, same technology that we're using for the logging part, I can now have them only do very simple guest action implementation, the individual actions that are performed on the guest, and the config that tells the system to deploy that. With that, they only need to do very limited coding, and I can document this in like 1 or 2 pages of documentation on how to do that, and about, admittedly, like 1 or 2 calls per month to remind them that there is documentation. Yeah, that basically allowed us to delegate a very small piece as a simple development opportunity where we don't need a full expert to do everything. So that worked well in that regard. There's one more problem I'm trying to solve with extensible code, and that is the classic should process dilemma. Let me show you. So we have here a risky command. I mean, I really, really appreciate should process. What if test run is really, really great, and sometimes the impact of not doing that properly is a bit more annoying than otherwise. But basically, everything that we can do with should process is, do you really want to do this? And the choice, the decision to say yes, is in the hand of the person running the code. We do not, and we cannot possibly, as Microsoft, provide automatically a risk assessment and what does this actually mean. There is no way we can do this. And there's very little way an author of a module could do this if he's shipping that to the PowerShell gallery and everybody in the world is free to use this. So what we kind of want to solve this or to make this better is to provide a way where another module can integrate into the flow control, into the decision making on whether we are good to go or not. And well, the way for that, let's go with the conditional access scenario. I've got a module called conditional access, and it's designed to manage conditional access policies. It has a command called update CA policy, which is probably going to modify a few highly sensitive things. the command has the usual begin process end phase. And there's an event system. This is again some storage inside of the module where I can sign up for an event. When this happens, run the following script block. Again, it's some kind of plugin-like thing at the end. So what the update CA policy is doing, it's going to execute the pre-check event and look in that system, is there anything that signed up for my pre-check event? And, well, look at that. Contoso policy actually deploys an pre-check event configuration with a script block that is supposed to execute when this event fires. And with that, another module can basically say, hey, please run this validation script first and say yes or no. Saying no usually involves some really red text and terminating errors and things like that. I know they're not everybody's friend. Another thing that we can do with this is provide a dependency loop. This Contoso policy is going to have a dependency on conditional access. Even if they are within the same organization and could easily modify both modules, having circular dependency is kind of a problem. And having only one take the dependency of the other and have conditional access call an actual Contoso policy command, even if there's no dependency, that's kind of the recipe for things going really bad. Especially because you can install module conditional access without the other, and then run the command and it's trying to command that doesn't exist. So this kind of flow control with an event system that allows us to provide some logic there works really well. I use this extensively in the Active Directory Management framework to avoid accidentally applying the wrong configuration to the wrong forest. Because otherwise it would be quite simple to accidentally, level your entire tier 0 delegation service. Yeah, and that's PowerPoint survived. Let's take a look how this works in practice. I have prepared some sample modules for the whole thing because of what modules there is. It's a bit hard to make this all work well. And the first one is resolve identity. Resolve identity is my default mini module template for how I do modules with all the release pipeline stuff and everything. But fundamentally, it has a public functions folder and an internal functions folder. And it all starts with this nice little script scope variable. A script scope variable is a module-wide variable, and it's a hash table in this case, which is where we can register all the plugins in. Whether we implement them in our own module or outside, doesn't really matter. I also have some sample configuration for the module. In this case, which plugin should be used by default. What we're doing with this module is resolving an identity. I give you a name, give me, the identity for whatever service. If you're looking to more configuration, there's this small PowerShell module here that definitely is not too complicated and not from yours truly, but we have a config system. Not going to delve too deeply into there. We have some data storage inside of a module where the plugins go. The plugins go mostly here with a register command. I want to register this new plugin under this name with the following description and the code that actually resolves the identity. And all this command is doing is, assign them to the storage. And if this is the first plugin ever, it magically becomes the new default plugin that is used. And, resolve identity actually executes the whole thing. We take the identity to resolve. We can specify the provider. And after some validation, we execute the code provided by that provider. Please do not use the invoke method on script blocks unless you have a high pain tolerance. That's basically what we need to do in order to make this whole thing happen, other than we need some plugin that does the job. I've got one provided in the module, which is going to use get AD user, Active Directory plugin, resolve the user against AD, and provide some output object. Metadata, register, part of the import sequence, done. And import it, resolve identity. Identity. Is my good old Max Mustermann. We have an ID, that's it. We have the user type. We have the system type where it's coming from and what domain it was. Can try it again. Same thing again with unknown. And it's complaining user not found. So this is now the module, resolve identity. I can push that to the PowerShell gallery and it's going to do the job. You can resolve Active Directory use of that. Now, that's nice, but Contoso identity doesn't use Active Directory anymore. They're using Entra. So they can use that, but they will need to provide a plugin that switches that over to Entra ID. So we have here the initialize that is going to change the configuration to Entra so that we by default no longer use Active Directory if I keep the old default if there's no purpose in it. And we have a new plugin that is going to use Entra auth as authentication and request handler and is going to connect if there is not yet a graph token. And then they're going to execute a request. Admittedly, they were lazy. They have hard-coded the client ID and tenant ID inside of their module in a dedicated variables file, but still not ideal to put hard-coded values into your code. But, well, it's an internal module, and they'll do this next week when they finally adopt PS Framework. So, plugin executes Entra request, provides data, done. We are registering it. We already set it to default. Which means after I finish the import, not F9, Fred, F8, wait, there we go. I can now try to resolve identity and that's not going to work all that well. It's trying to connect because not connected yet. And please don't make me do the MFA. It will make me do the other part. Did I ever mention that no demo survives the first hostile contact? Yep. Yes. It worked. Definitely not. Security is a great thing, unless you're trying to demo it. And once again, the enemy has been beaten. So we are connected, and unfortunately, this user is not existent in the tenant, and well, too bad. Didn't work. But there's this mark at psfred.onmicrosoft.com. And if I don't double dot it, it might actually work. There we go, mark. So, plugin implemented, plugin resolved, done. That's the whole technical steps to build a simple plugin system. We would usually invest a bit more time into configuration, make it properly configurable, make the configuration system flexible, but that is an entire presentation all on its own. But I've got a link in the materials. You can always ambush me for some live PS Framework demo. No worries. I will be happy to tell you more. It's just we can't put that in here. That said, I'm now going to do something that's physically painful for me. But I really can't hold out on you and showing you that. And there is this one practice that I see misused so often that I have a revulsion against dynamic parameters. The thing is, dynamic parameters were literally implemented to solve this extensibility problem with, well, the PS provider system, at least as far as I'm aware. I mean, we have the person who can confirm that. Yep. Got the confirmation. So yes, dynamic parameters are usually intended to, well, work well with plugin system to have plugin specific behavior. The unfortunate thing is that back in PowerShell version 2, it was also the only way to really do dynamic tab completion with dynamically calculated validate sets. Please don't do this to me and mankind. But for plugins, it works. So I'm going to remove the old versions. And a reminder for me, because I literally would have gone into live demo before showing how it's done. Here's the thing. Active Directory has a few interesting parameters that might be needed, like server and credential. They might be needed, but they will not always be needed. The Entra ID resolution is not going to need those two. I hope you don't need a credential parameter. Please tell me you don't need a credential parameter. So, yeah, collapsing everything under plugins. Let's take a look at Resolve Identity, which now has an update to the Active Directory provider in that we support a parameter for hash tables, for one hash table, which can be splatted into getAdUser. And we have a new parameter on the register. We can now specify the names of the parameters my plugin is going to accept. And with that, we go into Resolve Identity, have some argument completion for which provider is selected, and have this new block here called dynamic param. Dynamic param needs to return one runtime defined parameter dictionary with or without entries. You can return an empty one if there's no reason to. And then there's this next problem. Default values do not exist during the dynamic param step. So if you want to make this work and you have a default value, you need to make sure you recover that, which I'm doing here by declaring a new variable provider name and resolving that properly. If we don't have a provider name at all, we just return an empty thing. We don't need to error out because somebody has a user error. That's not on us, that's on them. And for each parameter, we then dynamically do a bit of voodoo that you can look up in the docs. Basically, we calculate the parameter and adding it to the dictionary. And finally, there's now one problem. We have dynamically added parameters like server or credential. However, in opposite to standard parameters, dynamic parameters do not create a variable of the same name in your function. So you can't just look up $server. Instead, what we need to do here is calculate for each of the parameters that the provider accepts from the PS-bound parameters, whether they were provided and pass them through. PS-bound parameters dictionary in your commands that automatically includes all the parameters that were provided. It will not include parameters that were not defined but have a default value. Not relevant in our scenario, but otherwise it might. So we copied it over in the hash table. And finally, when we execute the plugin, we provide that hash table as another argument to the script block. So, import it, and demo time. I'm going to resolve identity. I'm going to ask for It's not going to work. We have both modules loaded. They default to Entra. So I now need to provide the Active Directory plugin. This works. I can also ask for a specific server now. They were provided by IntelliSense. And there we go. Still works. And if I now try to change this to another domain controller, that doesn't exist, unfortunately. So now we pass through the values and the plugin can decide what they do with that or what they don't do with that. That's something you need to implement in the code. All right. So far, plugin-based system, there's really no difference in the technical implementation between I've got this logging kind of thing where I have cross-organization or I have the simplification thing, because at the end of the day, both of them are implemented with the same technique. What we also have is the flow control thing. So I have a few modules for that. Again, we are not going to have to look too far into those, fortunately. We have the conditional access one, which has, again, an internal variable to store the subscriptions. We have a public function to register them, which is going to create a subscription object with a nested hash table, so I don't have a flat table for everything. And during update CA policy, at the beginning, I just tell it, here's this event, the pre-check event. I'm providing some data to the event, so they have some information on which to decide the whole thing. And then I'm executing the whole thing. Invoke CA command event has one nifty trick here at the top. I ask them to provide me the PSCM delete variable from the caller. That way, in case of error, the error is actually called in the context of update CA policy and not in the context of this helper function, because it's the update CA policy that is going to fail and not the invoke here. So this is where the actual execution happens. All right. So far for that one. There is one more trick that I'm doing to make sure that everything works from the other module registering events perspective. Because nobody is going to force my users to actually first import Contoso policy in order to be able to run the commands in conditional access. So what I put in the Contoso policy is a little trick to help with that. And that is an alias. An alias that points at update CA policy, but it's organization specific. And I tell the users run this command, which will auto import the module, which is going to auto import my command event. My command event subscription, which requires that logging must be enabled or it must be a test policy, because I'm not willing to update a production policy without logging. So that's pretty much it. Let's give this a try. I'm going to try update the policy foo, which works because I did not disable logging. On the other hand, I now did try to update it without logging. Complained about that. And finally, if it's only test policy, who cares? And well, in that valid event script log, you could have actually verified that the logging happens and shut down every single change until that logging finally starts working. It doesn't have to be like a parameter thing. You can do whatever in there. Just one thing to keep in mind, the script log is going to execute every single time the event is invoked. And that can have scaling issues with performance if you are in a deeply nested command and having this event triggered 100,000 times. So that's something to, well, look into and consider how you want to do this. For example, the first event could cache the results, and all subsequents take the cache until an expiration time happens or something else is a resolution trigger. All right. That's it. Questions on anybody? Well, did I actually manage to streamroll everybody? Bruce? How do you test this? The question was, how do I test this? It's called Pester. It's a great tool. I can strongly recommend it. It also supports mocking if my plugin requires some actual Active Directory environment. By the way, I am not AD joined. This get AD user was faked. Some slight mocking going on there. So yes, I strongly recommend testing for that. For flow control, part in particular, you can have a test event and have some other tracking mechanism for that. So that works very well as well. In some cases, the scoping can get really weird when you try to do in module scope testing with Pester. So there is usually some way you have to fuzz around that.
Just having to deal with all the module scopes, you can get very lost.
You can. I've had this challenge with PS Framework logging because the logging example was totally not taken from my project. I had some trouble with that as well, but I do have logging this handled for the regular log file. For some of the online services, I just have faith that they still work. I don't have a permanent Graylog available for testing whether it actually works against Graylog. Just take the words from my users that they haven't have filed an issue yet. No other questions. In that case, I have one more part prepared, a few more slides. This is not exactly about extensibility, but we usually think about extensible code when we have already fairly complex projects or some weird situations and try to solve this. And what I have still prepared as PowerPoint slides as a kind of postscript is my approach to module architecture and how I solve module architecture when I've got a complex project like this virtual machine deployment, how I keep track of what goes where and where did I implement what. So I have multiple layers where I categorize modules, and the API layer is basically completely unconcerned about business process or even technical process. It maps an API or technical technical service. Like Active Directory module is an API layer module. I've got the storage module. It deals with the storage service, the local. Yes, it's an API layer module. I have a module called mutex, which manages the Windows operating system for mutexes, which is a way to orchestrate resource access across processes. So this is all API layer. On top of that, I have the process layer. The process layer might use one or multiple API layer modules. It might also do some things directly, but we try to avoid that. It solves a technical problem in my definition. For example, I have this module called KRB-TGT. It solves the technical problem that we frequently need to reset the KRB-TGT account in Active Directory. So there's an Active Directory thing happen, there's some group policy happening, there's going to be some remoting happening, and Fred likes to log things if the PS framework, so there's some PS framework happening. On top of that, we have the solution layer. This is where I put the things that solve the business problem, which is, for example, in the case of the Active Directory Management Framework, the entire configuration manager and the tool that triggers all of the other aspects. On top of that, the data layer, which might not be a module, it might be a config file, it might be whatever. And parallel to that, I have the framework layer, which is where I put all of the non-project specific, PowerShell specific technical implementations, things that we might need, but is not actually really part of the problem. Like logging. No project, or almost no project, is dedicated to logging, but most of them need logging. Tab completion, configuration handling, module template, in order to make sure that all of my templates look exactly the same thing. So whatever happens with the actual project that I'm trying to solve, the framework layer is basically always the same. I iterate upon it, take learnings from the last project, make it more and more so. And no matter the complexity, I always know where exactly I draw the boundary in which command goes where do I solve things, and how do I tie things together in a dependency train. Well, and if somebody asks me, hey, Fred, are you trying to tell us even more about PS framework with this framework layer? Yeah, that's kind of my framework layer, yes. So, thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great evening. See you at the party. And, well, thank you.